Good morning, everyone. I'm Pali Singh. I'm the IEEE SIGHT Education Subcommittee Chair, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Kunjan Mehta from Lehigh University, who will be giving our webinar today. So Professor Mehta is the Vice Provost for Creative Inquiry at Lehigh University and also founded the Humanitarian Engineering and Social Entrepreneurship Program, the HESI program at Pennsylvania State University. So one of the challenges in humanitarian projects is how do you sustain them over the long term? And Professor Mehta has a lot of experience in various ways of sustaining projects and ventures. And so we're looking forward to his webinar this morning. So Professor Mehta, thank you for hosting, and we look forward to a good presentation and some good interaction with our audience.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for the very kind introduction. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm really delighted to do this presentation, which in many ways is a synthesis of previous webinars that we've had through IEEE SIGHT. And I was asked to talk about sustainable operating models for SIGHT projects, and I went back to some fundamentals. So IEEE SIGHT, as you all know really well, is a global network of groups consisting of IEEE members and volunteers who identify and address local problems by applying their technical skills and partnering with their local communities. I wanted to draw attention to two things. One is the fact that we are focused on addressing local problems, and when we say that, it's very clear that the objective is to reach some sort of a higher sustainable equilibrium where we're actually addressing the problem and not just developing a temporary solution and things fall back to their canonical form after the project is complete from our perspective. And also, to do that, we need to partner with local communities. And how we partner, who are our partners, what are our roles and responsibilities, is something that we'll talk about further, because that is the key towards long-term sustainability. Can you advance? Okay. So probably a few months back, we had another webinar on the principles of ethical engagement, where we talked about the core constructs of community, self-determination, empathy, reciprocity, equity, sustainability, and ecosystems. And we thought of sustainability as a fundamental principle that we should be espousing in every single project. And if you have not done so, I would strongly urge you to go back and look at that webinar. And then just a few months back, I believe in March, Dr. Singh also did a webinar. Can you advance? Dr. Singh did a webinar on long-term project sustainability. And I think that was absolutely critical for you to view before you get to this seminar, because Dr. Singh talked about why sustainability. He talked about the pestle analysis. He talked about the social, technological, environmental, economic, political, and legal aspects of sustaining a project. And he actually gave us a bunch of excellent guiding questions that we should be asking ourselves and our partners as we are developing the projects, as we are trying to understand what our projects are accomplishing, what they are not, and the way we go about monitoring and evaluation. So that does form the foundation for this conversation. And in full honesty, I actually had slides on a pestle analysis, which I took out just because Dr. Singh did a really good job explaining those topics and breaking them down for us. So building on that foundation, I'm going to go through kind of a 5-step process with some fundamentals on the type of the project, on the partners for the project, on the logic model for the project, where we break down the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. That's a topic that has been dealt with before, and I don't see how we can develop a sustainable operating model if we do not have clarity on what kinds of outcomes we are hoping to accomplish. And finally, we'll talk about the bulk of the time we'll spend talking about some potential operating models, and then we'll wrap up on a quick note about monitoring and evaluation. And I think we'll try to contain this webinar to about 35 minutes or so we can have plenty of time for interaction. So a little bit of theory. Let's take a step back and think about the different forms of social engagement. And every site project involves some kind of social engagement. And we have an excellent framework um, that was developed through the work through research in social entrepreneurship and trying to define social entrepreneurship. And while social entrepreneurship might not be the goal for every site project, it helps us understand the different kinds of projects. So it's a 2x2. On the x-axis, we have the kind of outcome, whether the extant system, which means the current system, is maintained and improved, or we are trying to reach some sort of a higher equilibrium where we are creating that equilibrium and we are trying to sustain that equilibrium. And then on the y-axis, we have indirect action and we have direct action. So let's go through some of the quadrants in this 2x2 matrix. So first, when we take indirect action to reach a new equilibrium, that is classic social activism. So you can think about social movements, whether it is the women's rights or the LGBTQ rights movement, whether it is women's suffrage that gave women the right to vote. In that case, a lot of people, millions of people, took indirect action. They were activists. They did not take direct action trying to change the laws, but they tried to influence others to reach that higher equilibrium, which was to get women the right to vote. So I think most of our projects are not indirect in nature. They are more direct in nature. Having said that, I have seen some proposals and projects that are about trying to influence policy. And that's where we might be engaging in social or socio-technical activism. When we talk about direct action and we look at the top left quadrant, where the external system is maintained and improved, that is classic social service provision. And a good example of this would be a food bank, which through you're working with a food bank, it's really important to make sure that everybody has a meal to eat at the end of the day. And you are supporting a food bank very directly. You're working there a number of hours, but that is maintaining and improving the current system in small steps. But it is not obsoleting. It is not addressing this challenge of food insecurity at a deeper level. It is not helping us reach a higher sustainable equilibrium. And then in the top right corner, we are taking direct action to accomplish something new, to solve a problem once and for all. And it may not be for the entire world at large, but even if it's for a small community, a small town, that is wonderful in its own right. And an excellent example of that would be one of the site-sponsored projects called Neopenda that is working, I believe, in Uganda. And they have a new neonatal monitoring system to cut down on infant mortality, and the site chapter is working with a startup to test this technology. And if they are successful and they're able to get this monitoring tool to a lot of clinics, we can make a real dent to the scourge of infant mortality. So that would be a good example of a social enterprise. Let's be clear here that we're not saying that one form of engagement or one kind of project is better than another. We're just trying to understand better what it is that we are trying to do. So with this kind of framework in mind, let's move to identify the 5 or 6 common types of site projects. And if you can please advance the slide. The way I went about doing this was to look through all the site-funded projects over the last few years and see where do these projects fit across the spectrum. So the first kind of project, and I'm not sure why there's some missing text, is a classic technology deployment project. And I think that the vast majority of site projects fit into this into this category. Some of these projects might be developing new technology, but as you know, that is really onerous, and that can have a long research and development time. And most site projects actually do not fit into this category, although some do. And maybe over time, we'll be able to have more site groups develop new original technologies. The majority of the projects actually are about integrating off-the-shelf technologies into specific communities. And we'll take a deeper dive into what these look like, but a quick example would be installing solar panels at a clinic or a school in a rural community in El Salvador. And that's where the solar panels are off the shelf. and the site group is involved in installing them, teaching the people how to maintain them, and at some point they say, okay, the project is complete, and there are lots of problems in the community, we'll move on to something else. The second category is about entrepreneurial projects. Some of these might involve the design of innovative products and services, but just like tech deployment, this might not always be easy to do or within the scope of what a site project could do. And then I would make a distinction between designing innovative products and services versus developing a small business using off-the-shelf technology. So an example of that would be working with a small nonprofit to integrate a solar power system that enables the nonprofit to help people in the local community charge their phones, charge batteries for household use, and they derive some revenues from that activity. And while that is a small business and they need those revenues to keep maintaining the system and keep things running, they're not designing something fundamentally original that could be replicated and scaled very easily. The third kind of projects are education projects, and I saw quite a few education projects. You have discrete events like hackathons and maker fairs that are hosted by site groups. You have competitions, you have workshops where you're training the trainers, and the fourth category, and I'm not sure why the text is missing here, is around long-term education programs and long-term campaigns. Oh, great, the text is there. And long-term educational campaigns. The fourth kind of project are research projects. This could be project-focused research, where we are trying to understand better what the community's needs are and trying to figure out what the right solution would be. Or it could be more original research. For example, you have a low-cost diagnostic device, and you're trying to figure out what is the best strategy to integrate this device into the healthcare system of a region, of a country, and you're trying to figure out what are the right partners in different urban, peri-urban, and rural settings. What are the right dissemination pathways? How do you educate the various stakeholders about the need to get tested, or so on? Most site projects, I haven't seen any project-focused research projects that are funded by site, because the assumption, I believe, is that the site team would have done some of that research ahead of time before they develop the proposal. And again, original research is not what site projects are about. And finally, the fifth category is about advocacy and activism projects that are trying to influence policy, organize communities, or support a social cause. And while these are wonderful activities for site members and site groups to engage in, I'm not sure if that's a really good fit for the kind of projects that site is funding for the moment. So these are the various kinds of projects. Maybe there are other types as well, but this is just a way to think about what kind of project are you working on, and the operating model to sustain it over time may depend on the kind of project. So let's talk very quickly about the project partners. So the first question I would ask is, who's the primary partner on the project? It could be a group of engaged and concerned individuals that care deeply about a topic. They are loosely connected. They don't have any kind of formal organization. And that's classically what we might call a community, a group of people living together. They have a shared concern, a shared problem, and the site group, we are trying to work with them to find a solution to that problem. It could be a local nonprofit that has been working with people in that community for a long time and has gained their trust over time. It could be a local small business. It could be a local school or a local university. And there could be other partners as well, but it really helps to identify who is the primary partner for the particular project. And besides that primary partner, are there also other partners that are going to be playing a role within the scope of the project? With all these different partners, and especially with the primary partner, are we looking at episodic engagement that is focused just for a short time period to accomplish the goals of the project? Or is there a history of longer-term engagement? Have we built those relationships? And as Dr. Singh explained in his webinar, there is a lot to be gained by working with partners over a longer time period when there is much better communication, much better trust and understanding, and you're likely to go farther. Is your project focused on a specific community and trying to empower that community or enable them to do something? Is it focused on the larger marketplace? Or is it focused on empowering a partner, let's say a nonprofit that has worked in that region for a long time and they have a specific technical need which they do not have the ability to solve, and in comes the site group with its technical prowess and helps the partner solve a specific problem. And then the partner is the one that is then taking that solution to a larger audience, and we are empowering them in that process. And what are the roles, responsibilities, and returns for each partner? And another critical question here is, who is the primary driver for the project? Is it going to be the site group as a whole? Is it going to be a couple of members that are part of this site chapter? Or is it going to be one of our partners, a local nonprofit or the community or the small business or the university? And I think that it's really important to identify what kind of project it is and who are the primary partners and who's going to be driving this project during the startup phase, during the deployment phase, and also in the longer term. So I've been working in this space for the last 16, 17 years, and this is my little soapbox that I felt compelled to add. So in my personal opinion, I believe that site groups should help projects start up and stabilize. What they bring to the table are technical knowledge. It could be other resources. It could be funding, funding that comes from IEEE SIGHT, funding that comes from other local sources, from other grant-making organizations. They bring the credibility. They are engineers. They know how to deploy these technological solutions. They might bring social capital, which is nothing but your larger network and connections and other partners that can play a role in the project. The site group can provide training as appropriate and as necessary for the project, and other kinds of support over time with the objective of self-obsolescence, with the objective of gradually extricating them from the project and ensuring that it has independent operations. And we don't want to build dependence on the site team, because that is just not sustainable, and that might actually stop the site team from working on other exciting projects which might have social impact as well. So I believe the site group should be involved in the project startup and the stabilization phases, and over time extricate themselves, while the primary partner, whether it's the community or the local nonprofit, needs to operate, maintain, and maybe grow, if that's reasonable, to grow the project over time. And I think this is really critical to reaching some kind of a higher sustainable equilibrium. So a logic model, I think most of you have heard this phrase before, if not from others, definitely from me, because I've talked about it in a seminar before. I think it really helps to develop a logic model. It can take anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes, maybe longer, but longer is better, especially if you are developing a logic model along with the various partners for the project, because this is a way to have a candid conversation on what kind of activities you would engage in and what kind of outcomes are you all seeking. And if we have that common shared vision, we are more likely to succeed in the project. So what is a logic model? It's essentially laying out, starting with the outcomes of the project. To accomplish those outcomes, what kinds of inputs do we need? What are you going to put into this project? What kind of activities will you engage in? What kind of outputs? What kind of outputs will you be getting? How will you measure those outputs? And how will those outputs lead you to the end results that you are looking for? And the collection of all those results, and when you subtract what would have happened anyway, if you subtract the baseline of what would have happened, helps you identify and quantify the impact that your particular project has had. And developing this logic model is the first and the most important step to articulating the social return on investment from that particular project. We will not talk about social return on investment in this particular webinar. That's a topic for another day, but it's really important to develop the logic model first to calculate the social return on investment. So let's look at what some of these inputs, output, outcomes might look like. All right, so what are the inputs to a project? It's what we invest. It's things like volunteer hours, planning time, the money, the knowledge that you bring to the project, the expertise you bring to the project. Maybe you got a bunch of solar panels as a donation from a major solar panel company. Then that's an in-kind donation of solar panels, and that's an input to the project. The activity, so when you're actually installing those solar panels on a school, that's a specific activity. The outputs are so if you have the solar panels installed on a school that gives you 2 kilowatts of energy, that lets you charge a bunch of phones, that lets you provide lighting to the school in the early mornings and evenings, or that supports the school at night when you have adult learners coming in to learn, those are all outputs. But that is not the outcome. That is not the net impact. All those adult learners who are not able to come to the school earlier because there was no lighting and are now able to come thanks to your solar panels and the way that you have helped them access education and get educated, that points you to an outcome. Outcomes are much harder to measure, but ultimately that's what we are after. The objective of the solar panels is just to generate power. The objective of the solar panels is to generate power so that you can educate people. So that net human outcome is ultimately what we are trying to measure. And if none of those people would have been able to access education earlier, then the baseline is probably 0. And the gains you've had with the 35 adults who are now able to learn at night would be an outcome for the project, and could be one of the outcomes, because there might also be other outcomes with the solar panels installed on the school. So let's take a couple minutes to just look at the distinction between outputs and outcomes. So outputs are the measurable results from your activities to the units of housing. If you have a solar lantern project, it's a number of solar lanterns, number of greenhouses, number of diagnostic devices, number of people that have been tested, number of people who have been educated. Those are all outputs. The outcomes are, on the other hand, are the specific changes in the attitudes, behaviors, knowledge, skills, status, or level of functioning that results from your activities. So how does the ability to charge phones in a small community improve the quality of life for people? Or how does it lead to a higher income? How does a health-related intervention help people avoid getting sick, go to work regularly and make more money? That would be an outcome. Or reducing emissions by a certain amount would be the net outcome. And that's ultimately what we are after. Move forward. So another quick example, some of my work is in building low-cost greenhouses. And when we get external grants to support the construction of these greenhouses, the money that through these grants is an input. The construction of the greenhouses is an activity, and while we celebrate after we have built the greenhouse, that doesn't mean that it actually works, that people are actually benefiting from it. The number of greenhouses we've built, the number of farmers that we have empowered are excellent outputs. However, our ultimate goal is not to build more greenhouses, but to build greenhouses that help people get access to food through the year. So the way in which the project leads to higher income, the way in which the project improves food security through the year, where people have food to eat during the hunger months, would be a net outcome. The way in which people stop migrating to the cities and running their greenhouse enterprises in the rural areas would be a net outcome from the project. And for every single site project, I believe that you need to start laying out the outputs and outcomes, and then start thinking about what are the metrics that you will use to track those outcomes. So for example, in this particular instance, the one metric of success for the project was the number of greenhouses for which our farmers have recovered their initial investment. And that's a really good measure of whether or not the greenhouses are working, the farmers are successful, they're earning more, and how much and how it is improving their quality of life. All right, so it's important that the site group and the primary partner agree on the logic model. It helps to write down what role will each partner play, what responsibilities will each partner assume, what resources will each partner contribute to the project, and that's where I strongly believe that every partner should have some skin in the game, and what returns does each partner expect, and at what point in time. So it helps to identify these with the partners, actually write them down, and these may change over time, and that's perfectly okay. So let's get to the bulk of the conversation today, which is about some potential sustainable operating models. I do want to give the caveat that this is most certainly not an exhaustive list of operating models, but what I want you to think about here is the process, the way of thinking, the way of approaching these models so that you can figure out your own model. So let's look at this in terms of the kinds of projects. And let's start with the technology deployment projects, which actually form the bulk of site-funded projects. So one model is that the local nonprofit operates the project in the longer term. And if you remember what I just said, the site chapter takes responsibility for helping the nonprofit get the project up and running. Several examples of this is a Crowfoot Education Center that works with Native Americans or Native Canadians, I believe. There are several projects around installing solar panels in clinics, ICT center at a school, etc. There might be some revenue generation involved by the nonprofit that helps them staff the center. So maybe you charge people a small amount of money to use the computers at this ICT center or access the internet, and that money helps you staff the center, and there is some money set aside for maintaining the equipment, which brings me to another fundamental assumptions we need to have across all our projects, since they are technology based, that we do need funds. We do need funds for upkeep and maintenance and repairs. Every single technology is going to require maintenance and repairs, and having a method to raise those funds over time and having an operating budget helps us keep the project running for a longer time period. What's the target group? Do we have beneficiaries? Is that the entire community, or do we have customers where this nonprofit is enabling and supporting small-scale businesses, which then has a cascading effect because those small-scale businesses create more opportunities for the local community, and then there is more money going around the community. In this case, it helps for the site group to have formal contracts, project management and accountability structures, etc., developed so that there's a clean handover from the startup phase to the operations phase. And while the site chapter might still be involved in a supporting role over time, the transition and the signing of the contract marks a clear handover of the project from the site chapter to the nonprofit that's going to be operating the project in the longer term. And as much as I believe in gentlemen's promises and working with the handshake, I do believe that it really helps to formalize the project a little bit and helps the communities we are working with, the nonprofits we are working in, that this is a very serious effort, and we expect them to take their responsibilities very seriously. So this is one very common sustainable operating model. So the question then is, can this nonprofit be an individual? Should a site chapter work with an individual and empower and support that individual? Maybe. I'm not sure how impactful that would be, but there would definitely be cases where it might make sense for a site chapter to work with a very specific individual and support their efforts rather than support a larger nonprofit that supports more people. Can the primary partner be a business? And this is where we get into a whole bunch of complex questions. And maybe for some of you, the knee-jerk reaction might be no. We need to work with nonprofits and not with formal businesses that exist to make money for the business owners. But I think there are some good exceptions to that case, and this might be something to consider for certain kinds of projects. What if it's a business that is now able to serve a marginalized group? And earlier, a nonprofit, and earlier there was a specific group of people that were not able to access energy, for example, or access some of the resource. And this business now, working with them, helps you open the market up for folks who were disenfranchised earlier. Maybe there isn't a nonprofit that can serve that role right now, and hence it makes sense to work with a business, because that is the only entity that has the expertise and the capacity to deliver. Maybe the business is interested in investing in social impact themselves, and this could be a way for them to kind of work with the site chapter and make their products and services available to a larger demographic. And that might be something to consider as a viable and practical project, since you're not just empowering that business and a few individuals, but the benefits are seen by a larger group. Can the primary partner be a community, a group of engaged citizens? And, this is how a number of our projects are structured. But these are a few questions to consider when you're thinking about, well, this is great, we are helping these people, but how do we make this more sustainable in the longer term? How large is the catchment area? Does your project support 20 families, 200 families, 2,000 families? What services and what products do you provide? I think when I look through through all the funded projects, most of them are based on technology products, but then they provide a service, whether it's access to energy, access to internet, access to education, whatever else. So we are providing a service, but oftentimes, for example, with microgrids, it often makes sense to sell products alongside providing those services, because that opens another revenue stream for that project. And in microgrids, I know for sure that it's often more profitable to sell products like solar lanterns, like small televisions, radios, what have you, that then use the power that is generated or the service that are provided by that microgrid. And that revenue stream can help make the project more sustainable, because now there's a larger operating budget. Are the rates for the services and products subsidized for anyone? Is the community willing to actually formalize themselves and form a cooperative or a more formal structure with clear leadership, with clear accountability and clear responsibility? Does that leadership structure have fair representation from the various constituents that are going to be benefiting from that project? Are various groups, whether it's previously marginalized or disenfranchised people, whether it's women, are they well represented, and is there equity in that leadership structure? Does that group have they worked together in the past? Do they trust each other? Is there social capital? And I think working with a group of people that have worked in the past and have that deep bond is really helpful in project continuity. And in my observation, it's actually becoming very easy to register these kinds of formal groups and projects with the local government. It takes just a couple of hours, but that adds a level of responsibility to this community group. And instead of being like a vague set of people, now you know that this community of 400 families, there are 7 specific individuals that are going to take responsibility. They are democratically elected or nominated by the various constituents in the community. And that really elevates the project and makes it more sustainable. So those were the classic technology deployment projects. Let's spend a couple minutes on entrepreneurial projects. Let's say one scenario is that a site chapter jumpstarts a new entrepreneurial venture. How reasonable is this? It's actually not very reasonable right now, because new technology development can be very resource intensive, can take long time periods, and that's beyond the scope of the kind of funding and the kind of time that most site chapters can devote towards a project. But it can happen, and that would be wonderful, right? But at the same time, there are significant challenges with intellectual property and ownership if you have a site chapter with 60 members that are working on an entrepreneurial project. Because at some point, for it to fulfill its destiny, for it to kind of reach its full potential, an individual or a small team might need to break away and establish clear ownership and commercialization or dissemination pathways to get that new new product, get that new tech product or service into the marketplace. Having said that, while this is not what most projects look like, this could happen, and that's wonderful because that I see that as one of the collateral benefits of being part of a group like SIGHT, where you are working to empower local communities, and you come across an innovation that might benefit a larger community or marketplace and might create value for you at the same time. Another somewhat difficult but possible to envision project would be where a SIGHT chapter initiates and operates a small business that is built on off-the-shelf technology. That brings up the fundamental question of whether we should be in the business of running small businesses. Maybe it could, maybe not, but maybe it could also be a revenue source for other projects. There are significant challenges with ownership and equity, and just like the previous case, ultimately an individual or a small team might need to break away and establish clear ownership and business operations. But it's, it's possible it can be done. All right, now we get to somewhat more reasonable entrepreneurial projects, like a SIGHT chapter supporting an entrepreneurial venture. And an excellent example of this that I cited earlier is a Neopenda neonatal monitor, where the SIGHT chapter, whether it's an entrepreneurial venture, they have developed a new technology, and the SIGHT chapter brings its technical know-how to support this complex new technology, helps them maybe tropicalize it, redesign it for local conditions, to field test it, brings their local contacts to help develop it further, and leverages their credibility, their social capital to support that team. The entrepreneurial venture remains the primary driver of the project, and they pursue revenue generating activities in the future, which again helps it move towards sustainable operations. But the SIGHT chapter really catalyzed, really accelerated the journey of this team. I think this is a really interesting way to think about SIGHT engagement. And I know for sure, as one of those innovators, that this is a very real need. When I work with communities in Sierra Leone or Liberia or wherever, if I could have access to a bunch of local engineers that can help develop this and make it work in the context, that would be phenomenal. So I think inspired by Neopenda, we should be looking at ways in which we can support other entrepreneurial ventures that have aspirations for large-scale impact. Another example would be a SIGHT chapter that supports a small business, where the business offers a crucial resource that is needed by a larger group. And an excellent example of this would be, let's say, a coffee roasting facility that helps a few hundred farmers. Okay, this is not a nonprofit; it's a for-profit enterprise, and you are working with them because if this resource, if this business was available, that would empower, well, sure, the business stands to make money, but they will also empower and support a whole bunch of other farmers. So although it's a for-profit business, given how capital heavy and expertise heavy the organization is, this might be the most practical and sustainable solution, and a SIGHT chapter might be able to elevate it with a very clear sustainability model, since the business is fully vested in ensuring their continuity. There could also be a situation where a local nonprofit, the SIGHT chapter helps get the entrepreneurial project started, and the local nonprofit takes over the venture. The SIGHT chapter is in a supporting role, but there's some larger questions on the legal status and of the organization in the country. Most African countries, most Sub-Saharan African or Latin American countries still don't have proper structures for nonprofits to engage in enterprise activities. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. So a number of these kinds of ventures operate as for-profits under the legal organization of a nonprofit. And the key question there is whether the nonprofit has experience running social enterprises. Some do, most of them are learning to do, but it's a long journey. And there are some deeper issues with the mindset of the staff of the nonprofit, their capacity to execute. There's also the question of brand perception. If a nonprofit has worked in a community, giving out stuff for free without charging for a long time period, it's difficult for people to then understand why they need to start paying for services. It can be done, it has been done, but it just requires a longer time horizon. There might also be some good questions to explore around the interaction between the nonprofit side of the house and the for-profit activities. Are they actually synergistic? And an excellent example of this would be side projects that are focused on educating people about a new technology. Could be treadle pumps, could be solar lanterns, where we are focused on the education aspect and helping people transition from kerosene lamps to solar lanterns, while there are a bunch of for-profits or non-profits that are engaged in the sale of the product, the solar lanterns, or the service, which is helping charge those solar lanterns. So these are some models for entrepreneurial projects. And let's spend just a couple of minutes looking at the third type of projects, which are education projects. So these could be discrete events like seminars, hackathons, etc. I saw that we have quite a few of these. I think these might be excellent community building activities, ways to raise awareness, ways to bring people together, ways to find partners for deeper dives. But by themselves, I'm not sure how impactful these might be, unless there is a continuation strategy, right? So a hackathon is wonderful if it is focused. It involves all the right stakeholders that are going to look at some of the new solutions that have been designed at this hackathon, and then actually there are ways to advance that work forward. And it's not just a cool thing we did for a day, we had a good time, let's go back home. So building that community is a wonderful activity because that helps you take deeper dives, but by itself, I'm not sure that's the best use of our time. Competitions. So a key question there is, do we really need another competition? Maybe we do. Maybe there are other competitions that in that niche. What kind of outcomes are we expecting from the competition? Is it primarily focused on education? Is it focused on actually developing a new technology? And those are two very different things. Who's going to participate in the competition? What will they gain from it? Will there be awards? Will those awards be merit-based, where a jury is looking at them, or are they network-based, like some of those social media campaigns with whoever gets the most number of votes wins? And that's a good way to kind of get more people engaged, but I'm not sure if that's the best way to actually screen for or support innovators with good ideas. So trying to figure out that balance between merit-based and network-based awards is one of the challenges that competitions might face. In terms of sustainability, are there any school or university partnerships that can help us keep that competition running year after year? Moving forward, the third category was about train the trainers. And I think this is another excellent way for site chapters to engage. I didn't see as many train the trainers projects, but this could be training K-12 teachers, university faculty and staff, vocational training like installation of solar panels. I come back to solar panels often, but a lot of our projects involve energy projects. And that's an excellent vocational opportunity because there are jobs that could be developed through this training as well. Working with government officials, mayors of cities, police officials, could be other kind of train the trainer events that site chapters could engage in. One of the questions is, how specialized is the knowledge that site brings to the table? Is it real technological knowledge, or is it something that anybody could kind of come up with and teach? Towards what outcomes? What are the partnerships for delivery and consultation? Can we work with a local school or university to keep this training happening on a regular basis, which might also, or integrate into the standard offerings over time? And this could also create new opportunities for site members where they are the ones who are called upon to deliver the training, which is an excellent professional development opportunity, maybe also an income generating opportunity for site members. And that brings me to the last kind of education project, which involves longer term education systems. A lot of the same kinds of questions remain. What are the partnerships for delivery and consultation? Can these educational offerings be integrated into the standard offerings of universities or technical vocational training centers over time? And who might be delivering these, whether the local teachers or faculty be able to do it, or would site chapters or site members be doing that education? So these are some of the potential operating models for education projects. I decided not to focus on activism and advocacy because that's a very different kind of engagement. Funny, no matter what kind of operating model you choose to develop, it's important to develop a clear monitoring and evaluation strategy. I'll refer you back to an excellent webinar on monitoring and evaluation that was delivered by Dr. McMahon a few months back. That'll give you the kind of base understanding of how to develop the right metrics to ensure, to monitor the project, to stay locally attuned, be responsive as things happen, and keep pivoting, keep changing course until you find a model that really works, and a model where all the partners, all the stakeholders can clearly see the results that they had envisioned at the onset of the project. So I'm going to wrap up the webinar on that note with just a clear reminder once again that we need to hold at the forefront the self-determination of the people that we are trying to work with, and engaging them in identifying these outputs and outcomes and what they see as the ultimate goal of the project. And people are very candid. You know, we're working on a project in the Philippines right now around plastics recycling, and we asked the women, so what do you really want to get out of this project? And they said, well, look, plastics recycling is wonderful, but if we can get a steady income of about $10 a day, that would be wonderful. And we respect that, and that is now a key metric for the project as we are in the early stages of designing the technology and also the execution strategy. So we need to keep at the center the aspirations and desires of the folks that we are trying to work with, because without that, we're not going to be able to sustain the projects in the longer term. So on that note, we have about 10 minutes for questions and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mehta. So we have one question from Don Jerez. Do you typically have a defined life on a project with follow-up at end of life? For example, a solar array may have an expectation that efficiency will decline over time. On the other side, a weather event such as a hurricane can require rebuilding efforts. So basically, how do you define the life on a project and follow up at end of life?
That's wonderful. I mean, that's an excellent question. And I think it's really pertinent to almost every kind of infrastructure project where there is going to be a gradual decline. There will be some repairs and maintenance that will be required, at every stage of the journey. But for things like solar arrays, as Don pointed out, there might be a very clear point at which the solar panels might not be as efficient anymore, and we might have to replace them. Or there could be a weather event. And I think that you have to go in with your best estimate on what the working life for that technology is, maybe 5 years, maybe 7 years. And that's where the operating model and building in a revenue structure where at the end of those 5 or 7 years, you have enough capital there to go out and purchase new solar panels and install them might be kind of the way to go. And so I think this goes right back to what we just talked about and the need to have a clear operating model for the end of life. At the same time, the weather events, and those are that's a real issue with climate change. We are seeing more and more extreme weather events that hurt all kinds of projects. And I think that's where all the growth we are seeing in the rise of insurance products might be a way to mitigate against them, where if there is a weather indexed insurance available for those solar panels, that can, again, the cost of that insurance can be baked into the operating revenue structure for that project over time. So that when that weather even happens, we don't have to go back and try to find $20,000 to get the project running again.
Great. So while we're waiting for others to ask questions, I have a question. So you talked about education and the metrics. So maybe you can say a little bit more about how you evaluate and measure educational outcomes, because that can take several years. So.
Wow, that's a tough question. Dr. Singh, thank you so much for the wonderful question.
So just some initial thoughts to share with the community.
Thank you. So I honestly struggle with this. You know, on one hand, I'm an educator myself. I've done a lot of educational assessment, as Dr. Singh pointed out. That can take a longer time period. But I've also, over time, gravitated towards this concept of transformative education. And an excellent example of this would be some of the work by Dr. Paul Polak, who's the founder of International Development Enterprises. And you know, he observed when he was working in India on various energy projects that there were a lot of casual laborers that were making about $2 a day, $3 a day, doing, you know, menial labor tasks. And he also observed that there was an enormous need for construction workers, and the work was actually not that different what the workers were doing right now, with the difference that instead of $3 an hour, they could be paid up to $10 an hour. So Dr. Polak developed an educational program which over 3 to 5 days would teach the laborers how to actually work in the construction industry and what's different about it, various protocols, safety issues. And now these people were able to work in the construction industry and go from $3 a day to $10 a day, right? That's beautiful. That's amazing. That's very clear, transformative. It's a very clear metric of success. How are we helping them improve their net income? It's not always that easy, but if I were to invest my chips, I would focus on those kinds of educational programs where I can clearly see the outcomes in terms of the improved income and improved quality of life. And there are quite a few opportunities. We talked about vocational schools and you know, preparing students to work as solar technicians, to work as wind energy technicians, to just go about fix people's cell phones, whatever it is. That's more transformative. It's easier to measure the impact there. It's much harder to do that when you're doing more kind of traditional education that is focused on skills development and mindset development.
Great. Thank you so much. The next question we have from Gaurav Sethia. While planning the logical model, should we be concerned about the financial requirements?
Actually, I would love to have Gaurav tell us a little bit more about what he's thinking. Maybe as I'm waiting for him, I would say, yes, I think financial requirements are ultimately, that's what makes or breaks the project. So what might be an example of financial requirement in the logic model? So if the outcome of my project in the Philippines that I mentioned earlier to help these women make about $10 a day, it's clear to me that if there are 200 women that are part of this cooperative, I'm not going to be able to start by hiring 200 women all making $10 a day, right? That's just not practical. But I can see how we can recycle plastics, take these waste plastics, convert them into high-value products, and create livelihood opportunities for 5 women. And then we go through an organic process where we all sit together and say, okay, who are these 5 women, and how do we grow this project over time? And now we have extreme clarity on the outcomes from the project, the growth model for the project, and what are the actual activities that these 5 women need to engage in to be able to make this project successful and earn those $10 at the end of the day, right? So I think the financial requirements, expectations cannot be swept under the carpet. And frankly, my own style is to start with those financial requirements first. I think that's just a basic rule for sustainability in my rule book.
Great, thank you. Other questions from the audience for the webinar? If not, I have another difficult question for Professor Mehta. So I liked your concept of having formal contracts for the handoff to long-term implementation partner from a site group, and I like this idea of essentially initiating a project through a site group and then handing off to a long-term partner. What are some of the issues related to the formal contract that you've seen in your experience that are important to make sure that are covered in that contract?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I have some experience with doing these kinds of contracts. I can think about my first project ever about 16 years back, working on a windmill in Western Kenya. And I remember there was a very clear handover to the community. We actually had the community, and this is a pretty large, about 250 to 300 households that were all going to be using this windmill to charge batteries. and they came up with a very, very, very formal structure. And there's like 15 different posts. There was like the chairperson, the vice chairperson, there was a treasurer, the vice treasurer, and there were a whole bunch of other roles. And they came up with like a 10-page document, which I realized later was actually a pretty standard template that they use for these kinds of projects. And actually that was a good thing, because they knew how to go about developing these kinds of documents. And they sat down, under a tree and came up with the roles and responsibilities. And they spent a lot of time, identifying and writing down the roles. It took them just about 2 hours to get the group formally registered. Everything worked wonderfully for about a year. And then one of the problems we ran into is that the chairperson had to move away from that community to take on a job. And there wasn't a clear handover from the chairperson to the vice chairperson, and we ran into some issues. Some of the bureaucracy, which I was very skeptical of, was that so anybody could deposit money into the account that they had opened to kind of take the revenues from the windmill and save them over time for repairs and upkeep. But anytime they actually had to withdraw money, it required 3 signatures. And while I was very skeptical of that, actually I saw the wisdom in doing that and the accountability that was baked into this process. So while it seems like a lot of bureaucracy, I think that I have a great respect for these contracts. We have probably over 100 contracts with some of our greenhouse owners in Sierra Leone and Mozambique. And the most important lesson learned over there are 3 lessons. First is that you need to have women in the leadership structure, period. And those women, it should be very clear that those women are working on their own volition and are not kind of being a remote control for the chief or some other opinion leader. That's one issue. The other issue is, I think a leadership team of more than 5 or 6 individuals, actually 5 individuals is just too onerous. I think 5 is the magic number. 6, it's difficult to make decisions. You need an odd number of people to facilitate decision making. But 5 is the right set of people, and having large groups just makes things a bit too bureaucratic. Third, there has to be some kind of a growth model and kind of moving people on this leadership group on an annual basis so that others also get to have a leadership role in the process. The other thing that this contract also does is from a legal perspective, and this is something that site groups probably don't think about often, but they need to. From a legal perspective, this is a very clear handover of the risk for that technology, for that project, from the site chapter to that local entity. So what happens if that solar panel falls from the roof during a hurricane and hurts somebody? Is it the site chapter's responsibility, or is it the responsibility of the nonprofit or whatever group is managing that project? And that's where the contract can be that formal transition of that risk. Not to say that this is the way to escape risk. The site chapter should be, making sure that everything is built right. But ultimately, it's still important that operating partner take responsibility for the maintenance and upkeep. So sorry that was a long response, but
no, but I think that gave very good insight into some of the issues with these contracts. And it's interesting to note that there are already well-developed models out there, and we should build on those. So
yes,
that's very helpful insight. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, and thank you so much for really very useful and insightful presentation. Thank you also to all those people who tuned into the webinar today.